In 1978, I owned a little business in the little city that I was raised in. It was a city population of about 400 people in South Louisiana. And I was born and raised Catholic, and at the time I was a Catholic. I hadn't been born again yet. Another year would pass, and then I would be born again. But in 1978, at that time, I was a firm, staunch Catholic. You couldn't tell me Catholics could do wrong, because, even though we'd see wrong, we didn't believe that there was wrong going on. That's the way we were as Catholics. But in 1978, a woman came to work for me, and one day she shocked me by saying, "Yo, I've got a fine priest here in Maurice." And I said, "What do you mean?" She says, "He's a bisexual, Chris." I said, "Get out of here." I said, "There's no way." She says, "Oh, yeah." She says, "The reason I know that he's bisexual is because my husband is bisexual, and they hang out at the same bar in Opelousas." And she says, "Chris," she says, "his CB handle name is Glory Hole." And she smiled and smirked. But I didn't believe none of that. I really didn't. Well, in 1979, while reading the Bible in my bedroom for the first time in my life, because I'd never read the Bible, I had a wonderful, life-changing experience with the living God. Just reading God's Word, I got to a place where I was literally scared to death because of the sin that I was living in. And I cried out to God. I said, "God, I've never seen you like this before. I don't want to sin anymore, and I want to serve you for the rest of my life." And in my bedroom, from way down deep, something came up, and I began to weep uncontrollably. And I wept there alone for about a half an hour. And that night, I walked out of my bedroom a brand new man. All the sins that I had been practicing seemed to be all gone, and I was a free man for the first time in my life. Well, a few years would pass. You can about imagine, if a book that I was reading would give me that type of experience, I would continue to read the book, and I did. 3 years would pass. I would continue reading the book, and I was reading every day. I was laughed at by some, but hey, I had found deliverance from my sin reading a book. I wasn't about to put that book down because I had not found that deliverance in I don't care how many confessionals and how many priests I had confessed my sins to over the years. And no one had ever told me that I could be born again. And I was gloriously in my own house. Well, 3 years would pass by. And one morning I went to kneel in my prayer time, and in my heart, it's like a voice that was silent said to me, "Go give your testimony to the priest in Maurice." And immediately I said, "Oh, to Glory Hole." So I kind of got up from my prayer time, and I didn't obey the voice. The next morning, about 6 a.m. in the morning, that was my normal time, I knelt again. And immediately when I knelt, the same little thing. "Go give your testimony to the priest in Maurice." I said, "Oh, God." So I put a fleece out. I said, "God, if that's you, that's speaking to me," I said, "every time I go to his rectory," I said, "there's always a lot of people there. There's always somebody that's in that parking lot at his house." I said, "This is the fleece I'm going to put out before you. When I go to the bank today, if there is no one in that parking spot that's visiting that priest," I said, "I'll know it's you, and I'm going in." And that particular day, when I went to that bank, there was no one there. And instead of turning left to go to the bank, I turned right into his parking lot. And I went to knock on his door. And I said, "Sir, do you know me?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "I know you." So I went in, and I proceeded to give him my testimony, just like God had told me to. And I gave, in my testimony, I did what we were taught as Catholics to present a perfect confession, like perfect contrition. We did active contritions as Catholics, but this was a perfect contrition. And for the first time, I told that priest every sin that I had ever committed that I was ashamed of telling a priest in a confessional in my entire life. And I talked to him probably for a good hour, and I told him how I had been delivered in one night in my bedroom reading the Bible. After talking to him for about an hour, and him sitting there with his head like this and his elbow on his armchair, he gets up out of that, and the first words that came out of his mouth were this: "Chris," he says, "I'm going to tell you this." He says, "I know that you're not a bad guy." He says, but he says, "I'm going to say this." He says, "I've never been so bored in all my life." And he says, "I sure hope you don't bore other people the way you've just bored me." Well, from my spirit came this word to him. I said, "Sir," I said, "I didn't expect you to receive my testimony because I know that the spirit that's in you is not the same spirit that's in me." He said, "Well," he said, "that's okay for you to say." I said, "Sir," I said, "I heard that you spoke from the pulpit that Adam and Eve was just a fable. I mean, you hear all what goes on in the church. It was a little city of 400 people. So you hear what he said." And I was told that he had said that. I wasn't there, but I was told. He says, "Chris," he says, "everybody knows that Adam and Eve is just a fable." And I looked at him, I said, "Sir," I said, "if Adam and Eve was just a fable, then the Jesus you preach is not necessary. Because according to the Bible, Jesus is the second Adam to come and undo what the first Adam messed up." He says, "Oh," he says, "Chris," he says, "you think that if it wasn't Adam, we wouldn't have sin?" That's what the word says. Then he said, "You believe every word in that book?" I said, "Yes, sir. I do." Then he put something out at me that I didn't know the answer to. And I said, "No, I don't know the answer to that." In the back of my mind, I knew that this man was a homosexual because I was told that he was. Remember when I knocked on his door? I said, "Sir, do you know me?" He says, "Yes." Do you know how God works? Not in mysterious ways. He works in exact ways. And he will never let you down if you obey him. Behind my mind, I always doubted whether he was a homosexual or not. Less than 3 months would go by, and I was a truck driver. I was in my truck, and I was driving a mini float, so it wasn't a real big rig. Regular pickup truck with a long trailer that I would haul behind it. And I was in Lafayette, Louisiana, and I was in the turning lane in front of the old Target that was right there at Ambassador and Johnson. And I was stopped, and I looked to the right, and when I looked to the right, there was this priest, completely turned around in his car, kind of like this, looking back at me. And right away, I recognized him, and my heart began to just shake. I said, "Man, that's the priest." I picked up my CB handle, and I showed it to him, and right away, he went for his, And the lights turned, and he went one way, and I went the other. And the next words that came out of his mouth were, "What's your handle?" I said, "Kingdom Kid." He says, I said, "What's yours?" He says, "Glory Hole." And he says, "We ought to get together and talk." And I told him right then, I said, "No, sir. It ain't going to happen." But God had set him up, and he was trying to pick me up that day. God. That's only one experience that I have had of over 100 experiences since I walked with the Lord. And most of them have been greater than that experience. But I've said all that to say this. Most people, especially Catholics, will never know the truth because they're never taught to read this word and that this is the authority and this is the covering and this is what you check out your pope by, your pastor by, your neighbor by, anything. You check them out by this word, just like Paul the Apostle says, "You follow me as I follow Christ." How are you going to know if that man is following Christ if you don't know this word for yourself? And I'm going to tell you this. Darkness is here. And if you want to be left out in the dark in this last day and be deceived and end up in the dark for eternity, don't read this book.